and get started. We got a lot of material to cover. And so we'll go ahead and get started here. We're going to be talking about the problem of evil. Are we good back there with the audio? Yeah? You got the mic on me? I got it turned on?
Looks like.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to be talking about what's called the problem of evil. This is a philosophical problem that has been discussed long before Christianity. We have records of it going all the way back to like 400 years before Christ at least, where this has been considered and discussed. So this isn't a Christian problem, or even in opposition to Christianity per se. This is a theist problem, and by theist we mean believing in a higher power or a supreme being, what we would call God. So any culture who has had a concept of God, which is practically all cultures, they have this dilemma, which is the problem of evil. Okay? We'll start off here with a quote out of the Bible, even though we're not going to reference it directly much, but I think it's appropriate. So in Isaiah, it says, I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. Very interesting. Yeah. Anyway, so to do this, first thing I think we need to establish what we mean by evil. When we talk about the problem of evil, it's a phrase. We use it because it's the phrase that's been used historically, but it doesn't accurately communicate what we're really discussing in today's parlance. So in today's language, we look at that, and most people see that and they'll think, oh, we're talking about the problem of sin. And that's really not what we're talking about. We're not talking about just moral evil, right? Like what as Christians we would call sin. We're talking about evil in a philosophical sense, which means suffering or pain, things that are undesirable. And so, in fact, when you get into the more scholastic pursuit of this, you'll find that the discussion of evil as in moral evil is a very small part. They don't really focus on that because it's a lot easier to explain that. But what do you do about overall suffering? Natural evil, right? Like, what is natural evil? Well, natural evil would be like earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, illnesses that are not caused by some other person, but you just naturally get sick, viruses, right? Bacteria, infections, things like this. What do you do about, little children trapped underneath rubble in Mexico City? What do you do about whole families swept away in mudslides in Central America, or things like that? Or widespread famines not caused by political tyranny, but actual real famines caused by drought and by pestilence. And so those would be natural evils. And so when we talk about the problem of evil, we're not talking about just about moral evil. But that does include, that applies as well. What do you do about sin and things like that? And then you have what's seldomly, in fact, you'll hardly ever hear this mentioned in the philosophical discussion, and that is spiritual evil, which is what do you do about Satan and the demons and demonic influence. Now, Christians, we also have to deal with that, and that includes that. When you look at it from a Christian perspective, you also have to account for when you try to come up with some type of defense or some type of theodicy, you have to account for spiritual evil also. Although, if you look at the philosophical discussion on this, they'll never mention this. They don't countenance that concept. But anyways, that's when we talk about evil. That's what we're talking about natural evil primarily. We're also talking about moral evil, which is all the sin, the crime, the violence. And as Christians, we're also discussing spiritual evil, the fall of Satan, the carrying away of a third of the angels, and demonic influence. So we're talking about all of these things when we're talking about evil. All right? If anyone has any questions, please do not hesitate to ask. I'm going to be speaking quickly, but I don't mind being interrupted. Okay? So I'm not going to be asking if you have questions, but if you have them, you just raise your hand and we'll try to discuss it. I just ask that you keep your questions pithy, right? Don't make a speech. Just let's keep them short so we can try to get to the point. All right. So what is the problem of evil exactly? Now that we've established or kind of defined evil, let's talk about what the actual problem of evil is. So what is the problem of evil? So it basically goes like this. If God is omnipotent and omniscient and benevolent, why does evil, why does suffering, why does pain, why does crime, whatever we want to put in there, why does evil exist if God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent? In other words, if God is, I'll put it in perhaps colloquial terms, if God is all-powerful, if God is all-knowing, and if he's all good, then how can we account for there being evil in the world? That's the problem of evil. And if you think about it for a second, you should be able to immediately, figure out or immediately realize that's a problem.
Yes.
So one of the most classic and maybe the oldest expressions, articulations of this problem goes something like this: that if God is all powerful, then he could eliminate suffering. If God is all good, then he would want to eliminate suffering. So then, if there is suffering, there cannot be an all-powerful, all-good God. That's the problem of evil. And now, this problem is even if you're a theist or a believer, even if you believe in the existence of God, this problem presents some serious difficulties, some challenges to faith. And if you're not a believer, this problem presents a great opportunity to try to say this is evidence that there isn't a God. How can there be a God who's all-powerful, who can do anything, and a God who is all-knowing, who can know all things, and a God who is all-good, who wants to do all things, and yet there still be evil in the world? It's even if, let's say we just eliminate the whole moral evil issue, and we're not even talking about free will and sin and all that. We're just talking about, why does God allow huge hurricanes to come in and just kill hundreds of people?
Right.
Why does God allow enormous mudslides and just eradicate an entire village of people? Why would he allow such a thing? Can he stop that? Can he make a... And it's not even, it's a little bit silly the way it's expressed when you're talking to people who haven't thought about it deeply or carefully. And they'll say, well, God could just stop the hurricane. And that's really not what we're dealing with, the problem of evil. It's, why would God create a world in which there are hurricanes? That is really the discussion. This isn't about, well, God could just put his hand out and stop the mudslide. That's being silly, really. What we're really saying is, why has God created a world in which these things happen? Right. Couldn't he foresee what mud would act like when it's mixed with water, and what kind of consequences? I mean, we're saying he's all-knowing, right? And he's all-powerful. So he could have created a world where mudslides are not possible. That's the argument. I'm not making the argument. I'm just trying to explain to you what the argument is here when we're talking about the problem of evil. Now, before we get into trying to talk about it a little deeper, I think we need to separate this, especially if you're here and you've wrestled with this problem. You need to learn to separate this, because there's two ways of looking at this. Now, I'm not trying in any way to denigrate one or the other, but it is important to separate these. So there is the emotional problem, or the emotional response to this, which most of us are probably pretty familiar with.
Right.
And a lot of times when you're dealing with people who aren't really trained or in thinking or in logic or in philosophical outlook, that's what you're really dealing with. You're dealing with the emotional perspective of this problem. Right? It's like they'll show you a picture of, like the picture I put up there, of a mother holding a little baby who's dying of starvation. Well, that's really the emotional aspect of this. And this isn't to denigrate that. That is not to say that that's not very powerful. It is powerful, but it's not actual thinking. It's feeling. Okay? And when you deal with that, you got to be careful, because, like for instance, when I was doing some research on this, I came across a discussion on it, and they were talking, and this person was talking about how when Joni Eareckson, I don't know if you know who she is, many people do, she's the young lady who dove into a lake or a pool, I forget what it was, and ended up paralyzed from the neck down, quadriplegic. And when that happened, she says that a lot of people came to her hotel room trying to explain to her why a good God would allow this to happen. And the arguments, very sophisticated. Probably some of them were accurate, but they didn't mean a lot to her. This is like Job's friends trying to explain to him why it happened. And Job's like not having it.
Right.
Because it's a whole different thing for us to sit here and look out philosophically on the world, right? Theoretically on the world and discuss evil, suffering in that sense, as it is to actually sit, right? To actually be in it, to actually be the one suffering from evil. It's different. So you got to be very careful. We don't want to be so erudite, right? So scholastic, theoretical, that we don't understand that what we're talking about really affects real people. And they're going to have an emotional perspective on this that shouldn't be disregarded. However, it doesn't get you anywhere to actually consider it. You have to think. This is a problem that requires thinking, not feeling, right? And so, if you're going through terrible suffering right now, or what maybe even just relative to you, terrible suffering, well, then you might not be in a position at the moment to really think about this clearly. And this is going to require some clear thinking, which brings us to the intellectual perspective, and that's the one we're going to pursue. We're not going to really look at how these things make us feel. We're going to look at them, and we're going to say, what should we think about these things, okay? So that's the intellectual side. That's the side we're going to look at. So when we look at the intellectual problem of evil, or the intellectual perspective of this problem, we have to divide this then again into two different branches. And this is very important, and I'm going to try to make this clear, but you really need to follow on this, because if not, you're going to get confused when we start talking about it. So there's two different approaches to this. There's the logical approach, and then there's the probabilistic approach. And we'll get into each of these right now. Okay, so these are different. So what is the logical? Okay, the logical one is where you look at the problem of evil, and the assertion is, when you make this logical argument for the problem of evil, you're asserting that evil and God are logically incompatible. And we mean this in a technical sense, okay? I know a lot of times we talk about logic, and really we're talking about just thinking or common sense sometimes used. But when you're looking at it from a serious perspective, logic, okay, is a science. Okay? And it has rules and laws, and really it's basically mathematics, is what logic really is. It's an extension of mathematics.
Right. Okay?
So when we say something is logically impossible, we're not saying, well, that's real hard to happen. No, it means it's actually impossible. Mm-hmm. Right? Okay, what is an example of a logical impossibility? Okay, a square circle. Mm-hmm. That's just not a funny sentence. That is a logical impossibility. You cannot have a square circle. It's logically impossible. So that is what the logical approach to this problem is. When people say this is a logical problem, they are saying that if we analyze this properly according to rules of logic, we cannot what's the word? We cannot rectify. No, that's not the word I'm looking for. We cannot reconcile. Thank you. That's what I'm looking for. We cannot reconcile the notion of God and the notion of evil. They both cannot exist at the same time. Just like a square circle cannot exist. A married bachelor cannot exist. These are logical impossibilities. So also, you cannot have God and evil. Now, this is important for you to understand that because this is a logical argument, right, and the assertion is being made that it is a logical impossibility, then the people making that assertion bear the burden of proof. They have to prove that it is logically impossible. You can't just assert it, you have to prove it.
That's right.
And to defend against this, you only have to prove that it is possible for both of them to exist. It doesn't have to be probable. In fact, your argument doesn't even have to be true. It just has to be possible.
Right.
If you can prove that in any possible world, God and evil can exist at the same time, then you have conquered the logical problem of evil.
Right.
You can say, well, that's not plausible. It doesn't have to be plausible. It only has to be possible.
Right.
For this one, because this is the logical problem. You're saying this, you're saying that 2 plus 2 is not equal to 5. If there is any world in which 2 plus 2 can equal 5, then that is not a proper logical statement. Okay? All right, so that's the logical problem of evil. Now, the probabilistic problem of evil, that's the one you generally will hear more of, because the logical problem of evil has largely been abandoned because it's so hard to prove.
Right.
It is so easy to disprove.
Right.
I mean, relatively speaking, it is not that difficult to establish a logical scenario where God and evil can exist. And we're going to look at that here in a second. But the probabilistic one is a little bit harder.
Right.
So the probabilistic problem of evil is saying, okay, God and evil can possibly coexist. But it's not probable. It's not plausible that they do. That the presence of evil is better explained by the non-existence of God than by the existence of God. Now this is a much harder thing to defend, okay? So those are the two ways of looking at it, and it's very important, I think, when if you really want to discuss this, if you really want to think about this, you have to separate these two. And when I was doing some research on this, I found that it's very common for, especially Christians, to just kind of mix it all up. Yeah, conflate everything, mix it all up, and not just Christians, even scholars who discuss it. Right. I listen to them and I think, you're kind of mixing these things up. Right. So it's important to make this distinction. So when we talk about the logical, I am going to offer you some possibilities, right, that you may think, well, that's not true. That's not what the Bible says. That's not the point. The point isn't that I'm saying this is the way evil exists. I'm just saying here are some possible scenarios in which evil can exist even though there is a God. And if any one of them are possible, they could all be false. But if any one of them are possible, then there is no logical problem of evil.
That's right.
You understand what I'm saying? So we can say, for instance, a square circle. You say, we can't have a square circle. But if I could prove to you that in some possible world, there is a way in which you can have a square circle, then it is now possible. Because if it is possible in any world, then it's possible in this world. Doesn't mean it exists in this world, but it could exist.
Right.
You understand? That's the logical way of looking at it. And I know that and let me just make clear, when we talk about worlds, we're really not talking about the planet. Okay, when you talk about in philosophical language, worlds, you're talking about creation. All right? The whole physical existence, past, present, future, everything, everybody, all together, that's what's called in philosophical terms a world. So when we talk about possible worlds, we're saying if the creation could be done in any way in which it is logically consistent, those are all the possible worlds. And there are infinite possible worlds that there could be. And then we have our actual world. And the idea is that if something is possible in any world, then it is possible in this world. All right? All right. Okay, one other thing before we get into actually talking about how we respond to this problem of evil. It's important to understand that there's two different ways of approaching this, a response to the problem of evil. One is the easier one, which is called a defense. You make a defense. And that is, all you show is, for instance, it's possible that evil can exist and God can exist at the same time. You're not saying they do. You're not making any actual truth claims other than it's possible. Therefore, saying evil exists is not a fiat statement that God does not exist.
Right.
That's a defense. And it's very modest. And that's where you should start. I think Christians make a mistake and they become way too ambitious in what they think they have to prove.
Right.
So when you're dealing with someone who really is atheistic or leaning in that direction, and he's saying there cannot be a God because there's evil in the world, well, perhaps you ought to start with a modest defense of the problem of evil. Right? Not trying to come out and make a full-blown proof that God and evil necessarily exist together.
Right.
That would be something else. And that's what's often called a theodicy. A theodicy is where you try to make an argument that evil is necessary in this world. Meaning it doesn't just possibly exist, but it necessarily exists. And there is a reason for it, and there's a design for it, and there's a purpose for it. That's a much harder argument to make. And the burden of proof lies completely on you when you make that argument. Because you're now making a very positive argument that evil is a necessary feature of this world. That would be a theodicy. Whereas a defense, you're merely showing that this argument that they're making is not logically consistent. Okay? You're not actually making any claims about evil or claiming to have any knowledge about how it works. You're just saying God can exist and evil can exist. And that's what's called a defense. Yes? Theodicy. Theodicy is where you make an argument for the existence of evil. Right? You say evil exists because it needs to exist. It has a purpose. It has a reason. It has to be there. That would be a theodicy. Right? You're now arguing for the existence of evil. Not just saying, look, why it exists, I don't know. But that it can exist at the same time that God can exist, that is a logical possibility. That would be a defense. You see how it's a much more modest approach? Now, I'm not saying that one is bad. They're both good, and I think that as Christians, we need to move at some point in our faith, right? We need to move from making the defense to having some form of a theodicy of it, right? Especially as we incorporate in spiritual evil in the mix. Well, there's got to be a reason for this. Why is there a Satan, right? And is God all good? And these are all things that have to be discussed, and that gets more into the theodicy side. All right? That explained what? Okay. Anybody else? All right, so what are some common defenses for the problem of evil? Okay, so one of them is what's called the greater good. That the reason there is evil is because it's necessary in order to accomplish, or it's consistent, I should say, in order to accomplish a greater good. There is evil because it is the consequence of free will. You can't have free will and not have evil. That's a possibility. It doesn't mean that you can. I'm not saying you can't have free will without having evil, but it's possible that in order to have free will, and you also have to have evil. You have to accept both. That's a possibility, right? Or that what our world is today is the best possible world, right? As we look at the world and go, there's a lot of evil in the world. But how do we know if this isn't the best possible world you could have? They say, well, we could have a world with less suffering. Well, that's not apparent. It's possible that that's not true. And you can make that case. Now, I'm not saying it isn't true. I'm just saying it's possible that in order to have as much good as we have in the world, we also have to accept the amount of evil that we have in the world. And you can make a logical argument for that. Not that that is true, but that it's possible. Okay? So that would be some common defenses. So we could say that evil might be permitted because it serves a greater good. Now, you may think that doesn't sound logical, but it is logical. We go to a dentist. In fact, a famous quote from C.S. Lewis is that when he talked about people who said they don't fear God because God is good, he said, have these people never been to the dentist? Right. And this was back when they didn't have Novocaine, is when he actually wrote this, so that should explain a little even better, right? But I remember when Cole was he was a little boy, and his baby teeth would not fall out. I mean, they just would not fall out. And so we had to take him to the dentist, and the dentist yanked like 4 or 5 of them all in one appointment because we were cheap, and every appointment is more money. So we're like, no. She's like, we do one appointment. No, all of them, all at once, right now. No Novocaine. He's tough. No, I'm joking. I'm playing. No, and I'm sitting there watching them, and the dentist is like, just keeps putting shots because she's yanking on these teeth. They will not come out. When they finally came out, they were just enormous teeth. The roots were just huge on them. And they finally got them out, but I'm watching this dentist, and I want to just take and slap the dentist. And I want to do more than just slap her. I want to kill the dentist because she's hurting my boy, my son. Well, this is an illustration of how you can have evil, suffering that is permitted because it serves a greater good. Right. The amount of pain that Cole was rescued from, right, was much more than the pain that he endured to get the good. Mm-hmm. So this is an illustration of that. And so we could imagine a world, right, We could imagine a world in which we could say, well, you require a certain degree of evil in the world, a certain degree of suffering in the world, in order to have a certain degree of good. And that would be the greater good defense. And it wouldn't take much for you to think about that and realize, yeah, there's a way in which that can be argued, that in order to have a certain degree of good in the world, we have to have a certain degree of evil, perhaps. It's possible. We're not saying it has to be that way. We're saying that is a possibility. And that certainly is a logical way of doing it. And again, going at the free will, we could say, well, it's possible that if to eliminate evil would require eliminating free will, especially when we're talking about moral evil. Right? The greater good really tends to deal more with natural evil, suffering, and the free will argument is more directed towards the moral evil component. Because how can you have free will without an option to do wrong? Especially when we're dealing with the moral aspect of evil.
Well,
yeah.
So if there was no free will, then Satan would never have left.
Well, you would assume that especially we're dealing with free will as a principle, so yeah, it would include Satan as well. But what is your point there? Or just an observation?
That is what free will, I mean, he had free will, so that's why we have...
Well, we speculate he has free will. There's an argument over whether free will exists. So you may say, well, there is no free will. Okay, that's a thing. But let's just assume for the moment that there is free will for the sake of argument. Let's say in our world there is free will. Well, it's hard to imagine how you can have free will and not have evil.
Right.
Even if evil is merely the consequence of free will.
Right.
In other words, you don't necessarily have to imagine that evil is created so that free will can exist. You can just imagine that evil comes into existence as a consequence of the exercise of free will.
Right. At least moral evil.
Moral evil, exactly. Moral evil. We're not talking about natural evils, earthquakes and things.
Right.
We're talking about moral evil. We could say it possibly comes into existence merely as a consequence of the exercise of free will. Because if you said there's free will, let's imagine, don't think about it in the personal or in the immediate. Just think about it in the abstract, okay? Let's say there is a world out there, not our world, a world, right? Not a planet, but a world, a creation, in which there is free will and everyone freely chooses the exact same thing. Well, it'd be hard to imagine that is free will.
Right.
Right? You would say, if there is truly free will, then there must be somebody who makes a decision that others do not like.
Right.
Or that somehow adversely affects somebody else. It would be hard to imagine a world in which such a free will could be possible that resulted in everyone being identical and doing what's good for everybody.
Especially in a world with limited resources.
Yes, and then you look at that, exactly. You can compound it by looking and saying, okay, let's limit the resources. Let's diversify the cultures. Let's do all these things. And how likely is it that you're going to have a world in which there is free will and not have evil as a consequence at least? Okay? And what if you wanted to create such a world that had free will? Let's say that your primary driver as a creator, if you're the creator, your primary driver is to create a world that has free will. Well, it would seem possible that to do so, I'm saying possible, I'm not saying it's probable, I'm not saying this is what God did, I'm just saying that there is a possibility that you would look at that and say, the only way I can ensure that there is free will is that there must be evil to begin with, for there to be a choice.
Right.
When we talk about having free elections, we are presupposing there is more than one candidate on the ballot.
Right.
They have free elections in Cuba all the time. They do. There's just one name on the ballot.
Right.
Literally, there's one name on the ballot. And you can freely choose that name.
Right.
Well, that's not exactly a free election, now is it?
Right.
Okay, so what do we have to do to have a free election? If we were to imagine that to be the world that we're dealing with, the possible world of free election, well, we would have to have multiple candidates, and they would have to be in some way opposed to each other. They couldn't be identical. They would have to be somehow distinguishable, right? Okay, well then how can you have free will to choose good if you don't have evil also? Now, I'm not trying to tell you that's how it works. I want you to understand. We're talking about the logical problem of evil. I'm not telling you this is how God created our world.
Right.
I'm saying it's possible that he could have created it this way.
And the thing about that defense is that it also permits the existence naturally.
That's
It
right.
allows natural evil as well as moral.
That's right. But you see, this is a defense. So I'm not telling you this is a plausible explanation. I'm not telling you this is a biblical explanation. I'm just telling you that if they're saying it's logically impossible for God to exist with evil that we see, I'm telling you that there is many ways in which you can look and say that's not actually impossible. There are possible scenarios that we can look at logically and say these are logically possible, and therefore evil and God can coexist. Can. That doesn't mean they do. It means they can. It's possible. Okay? All right. We need to move along. Okay. How does the logical problem of evil actually get articulated? Let's just look at that quickly. So it kind of goes like this. They break it into points. This is how logical arguments are made. You have points that lead to the other to a conclusion. So, 1. An omnipotent, omnibenevolent God exists. That's a statement. Okay, point 1. An all-powerful, all-good God exists. Necessarily, an omnipotent God can create any world he wants. Okay? 2. 2 was suffering exists. I'm sorry, I skipped one. Suffering exists. So, an all-powerful, all-good God exists. Suffering exists. And the third one is necessarily. Now, that's a very important word when you're dealing with logical arguments. These are not just like thrown up there. And I didn't make this up. These are arguments you'll find if you do any research in this. These aren't my expressions. But necessarily is a very important word.
That's right.
You're saying that it must exist. Must. Okay? That's what that word means. So necessarily, an all-powerful God can create any world he wants. And then 4, necessarily, an omnibenevolent, an all-good God prefers a world without suffering. Now this leads us, therefore, to a logical contradiction. If an all-powerful, all-good God exists, who can make the world any way he wants and prefers a world without evil, then why does evil exist? Well, the only conclusion is either evil doesn't exist or God doesn't exist. That's what that logical argument pretends to, or purports to do. Yes?
Couldn't we just take out the all good? Can't we just have an evil God?
Well, you could. And yet the philosophical debate over that is, wouldn't God, we're talking about an all-powerful being, incorporate all good? And there's discussion on that. So there is a branch of defense against the problem of evil that basically says there is no evidence that God is all good. And therefore, the question is moot. The argument is void. Because you're assuming that God is all good. But most philosophers, and we're not even talking about theology, we're not talking about Bible reasoning, we're just talking about looking at it philosophically, thinking about it. I find it to be more compelling, the side that says that if a being is all-powerful, it has to include all good. And it goes into what is the nature of good, and is there an actual difference between good and evil? What is evil? Is evil something, or is it the lack of something? Right? So I subscribe to that evil is the absence of something. Like darkness is the absence of light. Darkness isn't actually a thing. Right? We call it a thing, but it really isn't. It's just the absence of light. And I believe evil is that way also. I believe evil is the absence of good. And so, if God is all-powerful, then he can't have an absence, which is what evil would be. You understand how you would look at it? I'm not telling you I'm not trying to make the case. I just want you to see why they would incorporate all good and why most, even Christian philosophers, not because of the Bible, but just because of philosophical perspective, would accept that God includes being all good. But then that leads us to the problem. If he is all good, that means he would prefer a world without suffering. Okay, so this is a very typical logical argument on evil. But let's look at this and let's see that they're making a couple of assumptions that might not, and I want to be clear, listen to my words, might not be warranted.
Right.
Okay? So the two assumptions are in points 3 and 4.
Right.
So the first one is, I think, very important, even for you as a Christian. Even if you're not interested in this discussion of evil, I think you ought to perk up and pay attention to this one, because it'll affect how you look at the Bible. And I think it's very important. So, and we've had this question here before. In fact, Megan asked it a few weeks ago about this. So necessarily, an all-powerful God can create any world he wants. Is that a true statement? Well, I don't think that's a true statement. I think it at least can be argued that it's not a true statement.
Right.
I think it is a faulty assumption. Okay, how is that? Okay, can God make a rock so large he can't lift it? Can God make a square circle? Or a round square? Can God make a thin, fat man? I know some of you are hoping he can't. But can God make a thin, fat man? Can God make two men who are each taller than the other? Can God make a world that has no God? Can God make a God that's greater than him? Look, we could go on and on all day long. You think, oh my goodness, God can't do anything he wants. Well, that's not... It's not exactly an accurate way of looking at these things. These are words. These are not things.
Right.
For instance, when you say a square circle, you think, well, is there such a thing? Of course not. Those are just words. You can just take all kinds of words and jam them into a sentence. That doesn't make that something that can happen. And you think, well, God can do it because I can just like jam words together, and he has to be able to do that for him to be God. That's just silliness. Are there things that God cannot do? There's nothing that can be done that God cannot do. What God cannot do or will not do, or it's not even reasonable to think of it in terms of can God do something that cannot be done. Okay? So, can God make any world he wants? Well, he can make any possible world he wants. Now, I'm not saying possible for you and me. You understand? I'm not saying God can only do what's possible for me to do.
Right.
But God can only make the world in a way in which it can be made.
Right.
So there is an argument you can make and say it's possible that a world without evil is not possible.
Right.
It must have evil. There is no other way around it. Just like a world without square circles, without married bachelors, without rocks so large he can't lift them, those worlds are not possible. Therefore, they do not exist. They cannot exist. They are merely words. They're not actual things. Okay? Just because you can say something doesn't mean it actually possibly can exist in any world. So that's one of the assumptions that they're making. The other one is that an omnibenevolent God, an all-good God, prefers a world without suffering. Well, that's not necessarily a ironclad assumption.
Right.
It's an assumption, and it's very possible that it's a poor assumption.
Right.
I can imagine a world that has a God who actually prefers some level of suffering in it for whatever reasons. We can think that it's possible that God prefers a world that has some level of difficulty involved in it.
Right.
Like, for instance, I can imagine, we could say video games are challenging, and many people are not able to win. Therefore, video games do not exist. Or we can say, I can imagine that a creator of a video game might not want all his customers to actually win. Can we imagine that to be the case?
Right.
Is that a possibility? So you can imagine, that doesn't mean that the video game designer is evil.
That's right.
Or dislikes one over another.
Right.
I can imagine that it's possible that a video game designer would want his video game to be challenging enough to stimulate his customers, and to do so, it means that some of them are going to become irritated with the game and stop playing. Losers. That's right. Well, can we imagine? I'm not saying that this is what God has done. I'm saying you understand that this is possible. It is possible to look at a world and say, you can have a creator who has decided that he's going to have a world that has challenges involved in it, risk involved in it. Yes?
So could a video game designer create a game that even he could not beat?
Yeah, of course he could. Right? Because you can design a game that you can't win.
Yeah.
There's, in fact, some of the most irritating video games at the very beginning, back before they were big business, you couldn't win because when you got to the end, they just went back and you just started over. It was unending, right? Pac-Man had a glitch in it where you would get into where it like couldn't be beat at the very beginning. So yeah, we can imagine that kind of a thing, yes. But in the sense that he can create something more difficult, one which we're putting in the sense of God, who is all-knowing and all-powerful, well, then you would say no to your question, right? Because then you're saying, well, then God isn't all-knowing and all-powerful. So that would then go back to these nonsense word combinations that don't have any logical underpinning. You see what I mean? That would be like, can God create a rock so big he can't lift it? And the answer to that is no, because it's not a thing. It's not possible. That's not even a logical concept. That's an illogical concept. And God is not able to do illogical things because they don't exist. It's just not that's just not something. That's a nothing. So you see what I'm saying? Okay. Okay, so so those are the assumptions that we have. And I don't think that they are necessarily. Now, here's the point. They're not saying it's possible that an all-powerful God can make any world he wants. Now, that might be possible. They're saying it's necessarily that an all-powerful God can create any world he wants. So in order for 1 and 2 to be contradictory, 3 and 4 must be ironclad. They must be necessary. And I just don't see that they are. I can just imagine too many possible worlds where 3 and 4 are not necessarily true.
Right.
Necessarily true. They might be plausibly true, possibly true, but not necessarily true, which is a very important distinction to make. Okay. Moving on, the probabilistic problem. Now this is a much more complicated one to answer. This is the probabilistic one. I'm going to read it to you quickly. This is how the argument would go. Instances of intense suffering exist that God could have prevented without losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. Okay? When you get to the probabilistic argument, they are saying, look, yes, logically speaking, there can be a God and there can be evil. These are possible. It's a possibility. But they're saying it's not a probability. Okay? And this is a good argument that they make. So they're saying there is intense suffering in the world that an all-powerful, all-good God could have prevented without losing any greater good, right? Or permitting some more terrible evil. So they're basically capitulating. They're saying, yes, there's going to be suffering in a possible world that is of necessity because of greater good arguments, free will arguments, and preventing worse evil arguments. Yes, so let's just discount all the evil in the world that you can explain that way. Dentists are an evil in the world. Doctors are an evil in the world. Bill collectors are an evil in the world. Telemarketers are an evil in the world, right? They exist to serve a greater good. Okay, let's just put all that aside and let's just talk about instances where there is intense suffering that serves no greater good. Well, an all-powerful, all-good God could have prevented those cases. Okay? And an all-powerful, all-good God would prevent the occurrence of any intense suffering. He could, unless he could not do so without thereby losing some greater good or permitting some evil equally bad or worse. So we're saying an all-good God, an all-powerful God could prevent it. An all-good God would prevent these instances of suffering, and therefore God does not exist. That's the argument. Let me put it much simpler with a lot less words. This really simplifies it, and you really ought to go back and look at the more full argument, right? But this is to just put it simple. Gratuitous evil. Gratuitous means without use, right? When something's gratuitous, it means it serves no purpose. No purpose at all. It just exists out of the pure caprice of its own existence. So, gratuitous evil exists. God, an all-powerful, all-good God, would prevent gratuitous evil, purposeless evil, meaningless evil. Therefore, God does not exist. This is a powerful argument. And this is really the argument you deal with when you deal with the problem of evil.
Yes.
Right.
Most everybody accepts that some level of suffering is basically a necessity. But that anybody who's at all sentient, at all has any sensibility about them, is going to look on the world and say, surely not all of this suffering is necessary. Surely not all of this suffering is serving a greater good. Right? I mean, I think we would all look at that and say, surely some of this could have been avoided. Surely God didn't need all those people to die. Right? And so that's what this argument is making. It's a powerful argument. You shouldn't look at these and go, oh, that's stupid. It's not stupid. That's a very powerful argument right there.
Yes.
Right? And if that is true, that gratuitous evil exists, and that a good God would prevent all gratuitous evil, then God doesn't exist, because we would say there is gratuitous evil, if we follow this argument. Okay. Well, there's some things we ought to look at that. And that is, one thing we have to consider when we consider this argument, and we look for a flaw in it, is that we are not in a position to assert that any evil is gratuitous. That is a very difficult case to make.
Right.
How do we know that some evil committed in the 1700s was gratuitous? Maybe it has positively affected us. Would that be then gratuitous? So if the abuses of the King of England against the colonies was gratuitous, or if some horrible earthquake was gratuitous, well, then that would mean that you and I, 200 or 300 years later, or 3,000 years later, could have achieved no benefit of it. So I ask you, is this a gratuitous evil? That's the Grand Canyon, caused by an evil. An enormous flood caused that. That is not slow degradation. It just isn't. Now, we're not going to get into that, but that's not that river slowly cutting away. And even that would be evil. But this was caused by an enormous flood, right? It doesn't have to be Noah's flood. This was caused by an enormous flood. Is that gratuitous evil? Is that a natural evil, or is that a natural wonder? What about that? That's Hawaii. Is that gratuitous evil? That's caused by volcanic eruption. That sand is imported. They don't have sand. They ship it in. Because it's a volcanic island. It's just all volcanic rock. So they had a huge eruption a long time ago. We don't know when exactly. And here comes these islands. Now, is that a natural evil or a natural wonder? Well, I guess it would depend if you were engulfed by the eruption, right? Or if you're laying on the beach enjoying it. It's very difficult to really assert whether something is gratuitous evil, because we're really not in a position to make that claim. We look at it and say, well, I don't see any purpose for that. Well, that doesn't mean it doesn't have a purpose.
Right.
There's been a lot of times I've been walking around in little shops or pawn stores or garage sales, and I come across some tool, and it looks like a tool, but I have no idea what it does. No idea. I look at that and I think, what could this possibly? This must be gratuitous. It serves no purpose. Well, that's highly unlikely.
Right.
We can look at things like viruses and say, well, why would God make viruses? Why would God make bacteria? Why would God make things that cause illness? That's gratuitous. He could have made a world, why would God put thorns on a rose? Why? In fact, some Christians think that before sin, there were no thorns on roses. There were no briars. There were no thistles. I mean, that's all ridiculous. It really is. Because we're saying that because we don't like thorns on roses, then they serve no good purpose. When in fact they do. They just don't serve you a good purpose. So we've got to be very careful when we're saying that there is gratuitous evil in the world. That's not actually easy to prove.
This is where often even the most staid philosophers depart and step into the emotional side of it.
Yes.
Because they're saying, you're trying to convince me that this young girl got brutally raped and buried alive, and that's not gratuitous evil, and there's some purpose to it. And then they've just left the logic, and they've left the probability, and they stepped into the emotion.
That's right.
And it's very hard, especially on this part of reasoning, to separate the emotional from the actual.
You're absolutely
reasoning
right.
part of it.
That's exactly right. It's very difficult. And that's why I said, I'm not trying to say that the emotional perspective is bad. And it's not, you don't want to tell someone who's been through an emotional experience of suffering and say, well, you're being emotional, you need to start thinking with your head. That's not the correct approach.
Right.
Yes.
So could you put this into the natural cause and intelligent cause?
What's
Like,
that?
where?
Well, we're only looking at the intellectual perspective. We're not looking at the emotional. So when I tell you that I'm not saying there isn't gratuitous evil, because we're not talking about, we're doing a defense, not a theodicy. So I'm not saying there is no gratuitous evil.
Right.
I'm not saying there is or isn't. I'm just saying that in the logical defense, I would postulate, right, that it is very difficult to prove that gratuitous evil actually exists, because of how interlinked our world is.
Right.
And how everything has such far-reaching effects that can last thousands of years. Thousands of years. Or like, for instance, somebody falls into the Grand Canyon. Is that evil? Well, that's an evil. They die. Boom, they die. Well, what caused that evil?
Right.
Well, something that happened 7,000 years ago. Or maybe, if we're not looking at it from a biblical perspective, they might say that happened 1 billion years ago. So something that happened 1 billion years ago, in that perspective, resulted in an evil today. Well, how do we know it won't also result in a good in the future? There's just no way. We're not in a position to make this claim.
Right.
We don't have the objective, the perspective or viewpoint. We don't have the objective standing in history and in the universe to make that claim. And then when we talk about this, we're always talking about it very anthropocentric. There's all about us, our planet, our life, our history. But we're a speck in a huge sea of creation.
Right.
We have no idea what effect our world has on the rest of the universe, and what effect the universe has on us.
Right.
So how are we in a position to make the claim that gratuitous evil exists? That's hard to prove. But this is a statement of fact, what they call a truth statement. Gratuitous evil exists. Well, I'm not convinced that it exists. It might. I'm not telling you it doesn't. I'm just telling you that's a hard case to make. And God would prevent gratuitous evil. Well, maybe. But we're again not in the position to make that thing. All right. So I want to ask you a question now about all this. Does natural evil really exist? Because we're really talking about natural evil. This is really what we're really discussing. Earthquakes, tsunamis, viruses, all this stuff that just happens and it seems so senseless and seems so purposeless and it's just gratuitous. Does natural evil really exist? Well, that's a hard question to ask. That's a hard question to answer in my view, in my perspective, in my mind. Why is that? Well, is dying in a hurricane really a natural evil? It's hard to answer that in my opinion. What are you doing at the coast?
Right.
You don't have, does anybody die from a hurricane in Kansas?
Right.
So we could all move to Kansas and nobody would die from a hurricane. Is it really natural evil when you choose to put yourself somewhere where you could possibly die? Okay, if somebody plummets to their death from an airplane because their parachute didn't open, is that a natural evil? Well, that's a hard case to make. What are you doing jumping out of an airplane?
It's easier to make the case for natural stupidity.
Yes. Nurse, what are we saying? Are we saying that God should have made a world where you could jump out of an airplane and not die? Well, then why would anyone want to jump out of an airplane? If there wasn't the possibility of the parachute not opening, why would you do it? You understand that's why you do it. It is the thrill that it might not work. It really is.
Yes.
It is that rush. Now, I know you're not saying, I hope it doesn't open. You're saying, I hope it opens.
Yeah.
But it's that thrill that you're doing something dangerous.
Right.
Right? That you're putting yourself on the edge of life and death. That's why you ride a motorcycle. There's no other reason. It doesn't have a trunk.
That's right.
I mean, really, yes.
There's no control over birth defects. That's a natural evil. When you're pregnant,
Well,
you have
there's no
idea.
control over many of them. There's a lot of control over some of them. For instance,
Not a lot.
you know, don't marry your sister. Right? There a lot of birth defects are
There's always an
preventable.
anomaly.
What's that?
There's always an anomaly.
Of course there is. Look, what I'm saying is, it's very difficult. I'm not saying there are no natural evils. I'm saying this is a very difficult case to make. Because so many of the things that we would call natural evil, they're actually our choices. Now, I'm not saying all of them. And some people have no choice. They live where they live because they have no ability to leave. Right? So I'm not saying there are. I'm just saying that much of what we call natural evil, it's a very hard case to make.
Right.
Because so much of it is our own choices. And is that evil? I mean, if I want to live on the coast, I'm accepting a certain risk.
Right.
If I want to live in Tornado Alley, I'm accepting a certain risk. If I want to jump out of an airplane, if I want to marry my cousin, I mean, these are all things that bear risk. Okay. But here's what I want to get to with this. This isn't to say that all natural evil is all your choice and your response. That is not the point. This is what I want to get to with this. So, in the context of our choices, we are omnipotent beings.
Right.
Okay? In so much as you can make a choice, you are all powerful. So, if you are all powerful and all good, because in the context of your choices, you always seek your own good. So you're all powerful and all good in the context of your choices. Does that mean you don't exist? Because natural evil exists in your life as a consequence of your choices.
Right.
So does it follow, therefore, that you do not exist? Because you make choices, omnipotent, omnibenevolent choices that result in evil. Well, no, that doesn't prove that. That is logically inconsistent. My point here is not to try to define where all. My point, what I wanted to get to, was this. Just like your choices do not prove you don't exist, God's choices don't prove He doesn't exist.
Right.
You understand? That's the idea there. Okay? We are way out of time. We're going to skip this, skip all this. Boom, 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 boom. I'm doing a mic here. All right. So, let's just get to this. I need to finish with this because this is actually going to be continued in the second hour. But this is what I want to get to here. We're going to end with this. I want to give you a proposed theodicy. I want to give you a possible explanation why evil must exist. So we're going to get very ambitious now. We've been very modest up till now, very cautious, talking about what's possible, what's probable, what's plausible. And I want to tell you a way in which it might be necessary for evil to exist. And that is what we would call a theodicy. And these are very ambitious, and so they have a high level, the level of evidence for them must be very high. The burden of proof is very heavy. Okay? So here it is. God's purpose is a world without evil, populated by creatures who freely choose to glorify Him. Okay? That's point one. Point two. Such a world is independently impossible. In other words, you cannot have a single world in which there is no evil, and yet all the creatures, all humans, if we want to call them that, can freely choose to glorify God. Because they have no choice.
Right.
Okay? 3. Therefore, God created a world with evil so that mankind would have the opportunity to freely choose a world without evil. And we gotta stop there.
My motorcycle has a trunk.
What's that?
You don't have to take
My
it.
motorcycle
Oh, that's
has-
true.
My motorcycle has a trunk.
That's a trunk, yeah, right. That's not a trunk.